right. Good evening, everyone. I am Chad Burdett. My partner in crime, Matt, is unfortunately was unable to join us this evening, but that's okay. We'll make do. I am with our guest this evening is Jeremy Holt. They are the author of such works as Made in Korea, Virtually Yours, Before Houdini, and the book that just came out yesterday, Gatsby. um, I believe it's the first original graphic novel that AWA has published. Am I?
That's correct. That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, awesome. So, so before we get into talking about the book, let's. I'd like to find out a little bit about you. Do you remember? Do you remember the first comic that you read, or maybe the one that
Oh,
kind of got you interested in the medium?
um, so I have been sort of around comics adjacently because of my oldest brother. So my oldest brother is a big or was a big collector of comics, and so I distinctly remember flipping through pages of probably Jim Lee's run on the X-Men or something. And I wasn't heavily invested in the art, and I didn't understand how the comics were put together, but I did like the stories. But not enough to start collecting them. So that was when I
Mhm.
was really like a preteen, and then didn't read any until 2007, 2008. Um, so I just was never around them, and it was really the same brother. I was hanging out with him in the fall of 2007, and he gave me a copy of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, and I was totally blown away by that book because I didn't realize Batman could be told in that kind of way. And I was like, "Oh my god, is this like where comic books are right now?" And he's like, "That thing's like 20 years old." So I was like, "Oh, okay." So then I went to my local comic book shop in New York City and just was like, "What are people reading?" And then I got hooked on to Vertigo, and it really was Brian K. Vaughan and Pia Guerra's Y the Last Man that convinced me to try to write my own stories.
And so, when you started writing your own stories, I mean, you said that Brian K. Vaughan is one of your influences. Do you have any other uh, creators that have influenced you in the beginning, or as you've progressed as a creator?
I'd say Jason Aaron also had a big influence. Scalped was a series that I was just obsessed with. And even Brian Wood. I know that he's had certain issues in the industry now, but his work stands on its own. And DMZ was another Vertigo title that I was just like blown away by how liberating creator-owned comics can be. And it's really why I didn't read comics growing up, because I just didn't want to invest the time in all the continuity. So it's sort of ironic that I've been doing projects for Marvel and DC and having to adhere to continuity. um, I'm discovering a new appreciation for all of that stuff.
And so, what was your first um, creator-owned work that you had published?
It was a series called Southern Dog that came out through 215 Inc., which not sure that they're publishing anything anymore, but this was back in 2012. And
Hmm.
I only did, I think, a couple issues of that, and then Action Lab ended up taking it on, and I finished the 4-issue series with them. But yeah, that was the first one, which was, I think, 2014.
And I think that uh, Action Lab is where I first heard of you.
Oh,
Um, not that we talk about Action Lab anymore.
right. Right. Oh, yeah. I know.
But kind of a side thing. It was some of my friends that I knew that were actually started Action Lab. So I was, but
Oh, okay.
I don't know, Dave Dewan, Sean
Yeah,
Pryor.
yeah, I know Dave well.
Yep. So, but that's that's another thing. We're here to talk about you and your work. Um, so um, let's talk about Gatsby because that's what just came out yesterday. Um, so what about the guy? Because it's an adaptation of F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Correct.
What is it about that classic piece of literature that appealed to you
It was
and made you want to put you like, I guess, your own spin on it, or
Yeah, it wasn't anything I really set out to do. I did not read Gatsby in high school. For whatever reason, it was never assigned to me. Um, so it was sort of by accident. This was 2017. I was actually doing some pretty in-depth research on a novel I was developing around a serial killer, and I was trying to design a serial killer from scratch. And I also had a lot of ambition to try to read 50 novels that year. So I was reading, and Gatsby was one of those books on my list. And so when I read it, I was so instantly enamored with some of the themes that felt surprisingly relevant that I shelved the serial killer novel and basically wrote Gatsby as a young adult prose novel first. And that's how it
Mhm.
started. And that was really not a good story. I will freely admit this. It was I had to get those sketches out of my system, right? And then I could
Mhm.
find what I wanted to focus on because I just didn't uh, really lean into the themes that I ended up developing for the graphic novel. So yeah, it was just a kind of a happy confluence of things, and yeah, and then it took a couple years to finally find a publisher.
And you found AWA.
Yeah, yeah, that also was just it just felt like kismet because everybody had said no. I pitched it to just about everybody, and I sort of kind of gave up on it. And for whatever reason, Axel Alonso started following me social media, and then we got to talking, and he asked me what I was working on. I mean, it's kind of a funny story because he called me. We exchanged phone numbers, and I was just like kind of enamored because I've known of Axel. His reputation precedes him, and he calls me, but he doesn't know that I'm at my grandmother's funeral. And I had to excuse myself because I was like, I know you all don't know what this is. Sorry, grandma." And I just had to take the call, and I talked to him for like 2 hours, and at the end of the call, he asked me what I was working on, and I said I had this thing that I thought was dead, and I pitched it to him. He said, "Sounds interesting." And then a week later, signed me and my team.
So we've kind of talked about, it being based on The Great Gatsby, or yeah. So, so how does your interpretation or your um, telling of the story, how did you change?
I think the main thing people are gonna recognize is that the cast of characters are younger. I did
Mhm.
this specifically so I could write a version of this story while also leaning into my unabashed love for teen dramas. So I love shows like as far back as Beverly Hills 90210, Dawson's Creek, The OC, Gossip Girl. So these shows I love. So I de-aged them so I could kind of write that type of story, sort of a young adult coming of age narrative, using the Gatsby framework as the template. And it also created new challenges because the relationships with the characters got to sort of change a bit based on their ages. And the most like I guess clear example of this would be the George and Myrtle Wilson character. The Wilsons are this poor family that work at this gas station. That Tom, and Nick, and Daisy are all going into the city, so they pass. But in that original text, they are a married couple. I changed them as to be brother and sister for very specific reasons, which people will eventually find out when they read it. But yeah, it was really sort of getting to write a genre I love, but also challenging myself to see if I could land the major plot points that were, seminal to the original text, and still stick those landings for the graphic novel adaptation.
And so, as you were doing your adaptation, were there, and you definitely, put your spin on it with, everything. But were there things that you had maybe trouble translating the way you wanted them, or kind of, you know, things that maybe? I mean, it's been a while. I'm gonna since I read, think I ever made it all the way through. So, were there things that maybe you wanted to include, but weren't able to, or
Yes.
kind of in that vein?
I mean, other than changing some of the relationships, which some purists might be upset with, the most one of the most important uh, parts of the book is the green light at the end of that dock that Gatsby's staring at. I just couldn't figure out how to weave it into my reimagining. Um, so that was one that went, and also the Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg billboard that Nick and everybody pass as they go into the city. That also played some had some very important imagery in the book. Also could not fit that in. However, I did sneak in the T.J. Ecclesburg sort of as an Easter egg. Like there's one specific panel near the beginning of the story that I show that. So anybody who was looking for it will see it in that one panel. But I do apologize that there was no green light.
Now, let's talk about the rest of your team. How did you meet the artist? I mean, have you worked with the artist before, or everybody else involved?
Yeah, Felipe and I met virtually, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years ago, maybe. Um, and we actually did work on a 10-page short for an anthology that is yet to see the light of day. I think it might come out. Uh, but he had been on my short list of artists that I'd found through social media, through online portfolios. And I approached him and we worked on it and we completed it. And then, excuse me, we didn't really have another project. I didn't have a project for him in mind. And so when I was developing Gatsby, he was the first choice because I knew he can draw detail. Like there's going to be a lot of very real world scenarios in this book, obviously, because it's set in a version of Long Island. Um, so I need cars to look like cars. I need buildings to look like buildings. I need the fashion to fit all of the reference images. He drew all of it and then some. I mean, he drew more detail into the backgrounds that I even wrote. So it was almost as if he was kind of co-writing it with me from a visual
Mhm.
standpoint. And it's just amazing to work with him. And he works so fast. He's a consummate professional. And then
And
Derbla, the colorist, I actually met through another colorist, Jordi Belair, and artist Declan Shalvey, because I was in Dublin visiting Jordi and Declan, and I met Derbla there, and we just kept in touch, and I really loved her work, or sorry, their work, and was really happy that they were available. And then Adam Wall, the letterer, has lettered all my books for like the last, I don't know, decade. So he's always by my side.
and so you were talking about how you kind of had like a co-writer. How did that? Can you go into a little more of that process? Like, did you obviously wrote the script and stuff like that,
Mhm.
but how did you guys collaborate? What was the collaboration process like?
It was very smooth. I mean, he didn't have a lot of notes. My scripts tend to be very direction focused, so I do
Hmm.
provide a copious amounts of reference images, just because I feel like a it would take way too much space on the page to describe the things I need drawn. It's quicker to just find the exact tone, mood, and lighting and all of that in one single image. And Felipe just riffed on it. Like he incorporated every single reference image somehow, some way he did it, and then he expanded upon it by adding details like, I didn't describe what trees look like, or we did discuss a party scene where Tommy takes Lou, who's the Nick Carraway character, to his family's hotel, and they go to this very fancy party. And the club that they're at is actually based on a club that my friend used to own. And I said, Felipe, I need this club, but I need you to make it like version 2.0. And it's got to be like on a roof deck. And he's like, I got you. And then he drew something that I didn't even properly explain, but he had a handful of reference images of the original club and he just ran with it. And that's just how it kind of went, like rinse and repeat with every page.
It definitely captures your writing very well, and the colors are awesome too. how was it? How was the experience writing this compared to your other works, such as Before Houdini and Made in Korea?
Well, because it's a reimagining or an adaptation, as you will, the hardest part was again those major plot points that make the book what it is. I needed to get to those in my mind, these checkpoints. But because I changed some of the relationships, because I changed the ages, getting to those checkpoints, I realized I had sort of created detours for myself. And so for the first half of the project, even three-quarters of the project, I was like just firing on all cylinders. I was like, this is going great. I'm hitting these marks. These characters are going in interesting directions. And you know yourself as a writer, you've done your job if the characters eventually start to speak for themselves, which was happening and was great, this amazing alchemy. And then it got to the ending, which anybody who's read Gatsby or even seen Baz Luhrmann's film, we all know Gatsby doesn't live to the end. So to get to that very important death, I realized three-quarters of the way through, I didn't know how to get there. So I'd say there was like several months, I just woke up and said, I can't do this. I don't know. I've written myself into a corner. And I eventually figured it out. And fortunately, at least as far as I can tell from AWA, everybody there is wonderful. No one said it was like I missed the landing. So that's
Mhm.
nice.
So, if you don't mind, can we talk about some of your other? I mean, one of your other books is, like I mentioned, Before Houdini. I haven't read it, but I mean, it just sounds interesting. What can you say? What was that? What was that? You know,
Yeah.
about? I mean,
So after
because
Houdini is, other than being the world's most famous magician, Harry Houdini is also a covert spy for the U.S. government. He goes on a recon mission to Russia and doesn't come back. So his government handler, Teddy Roosevelt, enlists his estranged son, Joseph, to uh, enter into this world of intrigue and magic, which is very real in this world. Magic is a real power. And he basically is set onto a mission to find the father he's never known. And so there was a follow up to that book, and the titles are a bit confusing because the first book is after Houdini, and the second book is before Houdini, and that is sort of a prequel because there isn't a whole lot documented about Houdini's life as a young kid. He grew up. His name was Eric Weiss, and
Mhm.
immigrated from Budapest to the U.S. And so before Houdini is basically Houdini's a teenager. He's this very talented illusionist and escape artist, and he's doing tricks all over town. And eventually catches the attention of an early version of MI6 who recruit him, and he goes to London, and he's teamed up with three other teenagers who have special abilities, and they basically have to track down Jack the Ripper.
well, I'm definitely going to have to check that out. um, was there a lot of research involved in, you know,
Yes. A lot of
getting?
research, but because I was making up some things, after reading it was easier to write because I really was making up a good portion of it, but I did sort of map out Houdini's life for a certain amount of years to kind of fit the story within. Uh, Before Houdini was a little bit harder because I wanted to tie it in with the Whitechapel murders, the Ripper murders, and in that story, Eric Weiss's government handler is the Elephant Man, who
Mhm.
actually, this is true, lived not only in Whitechapel, but the same year as the Ripper murders. So I was like, this is perfect. These things totally intersect, and this totally works for my story. So that was really nice. Doing historical fiction can be tough because you want to try to have the historical facts be as close to the actual dates as possible, but sometimes you have to fudge those numbers.
And was that? I don't know. I'm sure we touched on it with Gatsby, but having the, Gatsby is definitely is set in a, certain time period. Was it easy translating, you know, modernizing some of those things into today for the, more modern telling of the story?
So with the Houdini books, I kept them within the years that they happened. Um, so I did a lot of research into just like what New York City looked like around that time. the various cities he toured doing his, Chinese water torture cell escape and his milk can escape. Um, so yeah, a lot of research just having reference images for that. And then the Whitechapel murders, I wanted to actually map out the three murders that had happened in that week or whatever. And so that was cool to have all that information and to sort of find these sites that were you could do walking tours, obviously, of the Ripper murders, but it's cool to see
Mhm.
what used to be there and what is now there. So that was fun.
And sorry if I'm
Oh, sorry.
skipping around, but you also have done a graphic novel, Skip to the End, about Kurt Cobain.
Hmm.
Um, I'm I'm getting a feeling that you love to do his history based works.
I like grounded stories, and if they can be connected or woven in to a piece of fiction, that's even more amazing. So my favorite novel might be Michael Chabon's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier on Clay. And I tell everybody who doesn't understand or asks why I got into comics, I say, well, if you're not going to read a comic, then read this book, and it'll explain everything you need to know of why I love making comics. And that book is so impeccably researched that I want to believe that, Joseph and Sam are real people. That's how well they're written. And I've always been drawn to that. And I'd love to take a historical situation and infuse a character that didn't exist and feels like they could have. I mean, the best compliment I ever got with after Houdini was, "Oh, I didn't know Harry Houdini had a son." And I said, "Oh, he didn't. I made him up." So
And what kind of was the answer for the thing about Kurt Cobain?
I am
Were you a big Nirvana fan?
well, I'm a late bloomer to the band. I didn't start listening
Mhm.
to them regularly until probably 2015, 2016. And I was a bit too young to have seen them in their heyday. I was probably like a preteen when Nevermind came out. But I became obsessed. And anybody who knows me knows I'm obsessed with this music rock figure. And I've always wondered, if the surviving members could go back in time to save their best friend, would they? And if they could, what would that look like? Um, and I've always believed as far back as a kid that music is a form of time travel. I think music and scent are time machines. And once I paired this idea of music as a form of time travel with this narrative of a basis of this once famous punk band, you know, loses his best friend to suicide. 20 years later, he's a drug addict, not going anywhere in life, and he finds this guitar that allows him to travel back in time. At the same time, he's trying to find his sobriety. So it's sort of a struggle for the protagonist to figure out, is these jumps back into his past actually happening, or is he actually just kind of losing his mind? But also, once he realizes that time is not linear, that nothing he does in the past is going to change the present or the future, he realizes that he's a bit too addicted to stop. And so the book ultimately is an examination on addiction in all the forms that it comes in.
So, as a and I hope this question makes sense and it comes out correctly. Who knows? But a- as a non-binary author, um, how is how is that incorporating it into Gatsby? As you know, as you were writing your modern adaptation of it.
Well, Chad, that was a major pivotal moment for me, the gender identity component of my existence.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm a Korean adoptee and I'm also an identical triplet. So identity has always sort of been something I focused on because when you share sort of your face with two other people, it's sort of an odd way to grow up. But in 2017, I had looked at all the work I was doing and I realized that I was writing these white male savior stories. And I sort of was very over it because, I was raised by white parents. And in a lot of ways, I did believe I was white until I sort of had this reckoning with myself about both my Asianness and about my gender identity. And embracing those two things more fully gave me the permission to just write more authentically and think about what
Mhm.
is my story. I'm writing for an audience. I should be writing for myself. And so the first foray into kind of exploring the idea of writing my own personal trauma and narratives, weave them into a piece of fiction, was with the graphic novel I did for with Dark Horse called Virtually Yours.
Mhm.
And then that felt really good. And then I continued with Made in Korea, and that felt even better. And then to see Gatsby, there were so many places for me to weave in my own personal lived experiences to make this feel relatable.
Mhm.
And so embracing those parts of my identity was absolutely liberating, and it honestly makes me a better writer now.
And I definitely probably going forward as you continue to grow in this aspect will probably be embracing it more, I suppose. I mean, it
Definitely.
it it seems to be a very strong influence on your creative process in your writing.
I think it's just also about representation. So
Mhm.
I've been thinking a lot about the last few years within Hollywood specifically about so much recognition that the Asian community is getting. With first it's sort of like Parasite with Bong Joon-ho's film wins the Academy Award, and then Lee Isaac Chung and Chloe Zhao are getting nominated, Steve Yeun, and so I just realized that I didn't have that representation, and I didn't realize how important it was to me. So to see Ki Kwan win the Academy Award for his role in Everything Everywhere All at Once made me remember that he was my first Asian representation. But ironically enough, when people would ask me who I related to in, say, the Goonies, I would just say another one of the white characters because I just saw myself in them, which wasn't accurate. So the position I'm in now to tell fiction and to create entertainment, it doesn't hurt anything. In fact, it helps by providing proper representation. So anybody who might look like me doesn't have to do the mental gymnastics of like, how do I relate to this character who I don't look like, or I don't see any real connection. So moving forward, it's for me, it's about writing authentically and providing as proper representation as possible.
And I know you mentioned you've done some stuff for Marvel. What characters have you been doing? Again, my brain's a sieve this evening, so um,
Right.
can, can you kind of talk about, I guess, working in somebody else's sandbox versus working in your own?
Right. So the first thing I did for Marvel was for their Voices anthology. For
Mhm. That's where I saw
Mhm.
it.
The first character I did was a character called Silhouette, who was part of a teenage mutant team in a series called New Warriors,
Mhm.
and uh, yeah, her character was poorly represented in that series, and so I was tasked with writing a story about her, and I just figured it was very strange that she doesn't have a civilian name. She's never had one. And how can a superhero with the name Silhouette exist outside of being a superhero if they're also called Silhouette? And she is half black, half uh, Vietnamese, and she has crutches. So she really does stand out in a lot of ways. And so I just wrote a dating story featuring her, and I have her, adopt a civilian name, which is really cool because that, officially added to her canon, and she now has a civilian name because of me. And the second character I wrote for them was also for another uh, installment of their Voices anthology, and I wrote a really cool story with Mantis from Guardians of the Galaxy. And then the most recent one that came out maybe a month ago, I got to write for Silk, a 10-page story for
Mhm.
Silk, which is cool.
Are there any other characters in that universe that you feel need the representation that you could bring to
Um,
them? Or
yeah, I mean, as an adoptee, I would definitely want to write a mini series featuring Jubilee's son, who's
Mhm.
also adopted. Um, and I have this very cool idea for it that would involve Wolverine. But the other one would be to resurrect the Mandarin for a Shang-Chi story.
Mhm.
I have a really cool way to resurrect him. Um, but if I get those opportunities, yet to be seen, but that's what I would do.
And as you said, your first introduction to comics was Batman and the DC. Are there any DC characters that you know?
Oh yeah. So let's see. Yeah, I've always liked Marvel because that's what my brother was reading.
Mhm.
And so I'd never really invested any time in the DC characters. And to be completely honest, I feel like understanding the DC catalog a bit better now, I think the problem they have is that they just have a lack of really good villains. Um, but to get to know these characters on a much deeper level, like Hawkman, Hawkgirl, Flash, Aquaman, Wonder Woman, um, uh, Brainiac, I mean, just all these cool characters. And so for me, I would absolutely love to write a Flash story. Like Barry Allen is such a cool character. The whole Flash universe is such a cool thing. So yeah, if I had a chance, I would do a Flash story.
Oh, I would definitely read that too. um, so are you working on any other projects, or of course you can talk about any more projects you'd like to do with AWA, or anything like that?
Um, yeah, I'm always up for doing something with AWA. Obviously, I haven't pitched anything to the. I don't have any new pitches right now. Like I have a graphic novel that's going to be a young adult graphic novel that I can't really say what it is, but did recently sign a contract for that, which is awesome. I wrote a 6-part series for Marvel's Vertical Scroll line of comics for the Marvel Unlimited app. And so I got to play in the Iron Fist sandbox. So I wrote 6 episodes using the character Pei, who was the youngest ever to be marked by the Iron Fist. And yeah, so doing that. And I'm writing a new novel, which I'm excited about. Just wrote 3 chapters. Wrote the 3rd chapter today, and so sent that off to my lit agent for review, and have a couple other pitches. And we'll see. Yeah. Oh, I do have a short story coming out through DC's Pride Anthology.
When you're writing, do you have like I don't want to say a rich
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
oh, I was just kind of saying, when you write, do you have like a process that you use? You have to um do you have a set time that you write, or do you kind of
Mm.
wait for things to you know come together, and come together in your mind, and just then you gotta it's in there, it's got to get out.
Great question. It depends on when I was at. If I'm thinking about when in my life, because there have been times where I've usually had a day job. Like I worked doing tech support for like 14 years, and I quit last year actually. So as far as fixed times, having that day job, I mostly write on the weekend, so I had to sort of get very regimented about it. But now that I'm writing full time, I'm a I'm a professional procrastinator, so it's it's really hard to kind of create a schedule. But I'm getting into one now where I'm getting up around 7 a.m. and I write until around noon, and then answer
Mhm.
emails and whatnot, and then try to decompress. So that's been the schedule. But all of my work is heavily dependent on solid outline, and
Mhm.
then breaking that main outline into issue outlines. And once I've gotten all the outlines done, that's the heavy creative lifting for me. And scripting actually is pretty quick.
Now, do you kind of prefer writing in the graphic novel, one big chunk type format, or an issue by issue,
Um,
where you kind of have to do like a cliffhanger, and
yeah, I it's a good question. I realize that I've never had to pick because I always write it as a sequential series, as a mini series.
Mhm.
I know that, it's all going to be given, if it's a graphic novel, it all comes out in one go, but I don't think you're really taking anything away if you do have those cliffhangers. And I try to have every odd number page have a mini cliffhanger if I'm doing my job right. So yeah, I just write them as 22-page issues essentially, or if it's a graphic novel, chapters. And it allows me to write it both if it was to come out monthly or to come out all at one go. It doesn't matter. I've structured it that it works for both delivery systems.
Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about Gatsby that maybe we haven't covered? You know, you know,
Um, I'd say if you've never read the novel, you do not need to read it. If you have read the
oh,
novel, I wrote it. I wrote it to be this exciting teen drama. So like, it doesn't. You don't need. I'm not expecting you to like read the cliff notes or whatever for the novel. I just want it to be engaging and exciting and interesting on its own. But for the fans that have read the novel or read it regularly or whatnot, I hope you also enjoy the changes that were made for justified reasons, that it still honors the spirit of what the book originally was supposed to convey. And yeah, I just, hopefully it might bring some literary people over to read some comic books. That'd be cool.
we can always use the crossover. So, uh, if we're as we wrap up, do you want to kind of give us a summary of the book and where can people find you if you're on the social media?
Sure. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. It's just my name, at Jeremy Holt Books. Gatsby is basically my young adult reimagining of the Great Gatsby set in a modern Long Island. And it is a LGBTQ tinged multicultural thriller set in the internet age. And yeah, I just wanted to tell a sexy teenage version of a novel that I fell in love with in 2017.
All right. Well, that's kind of all I have. Unfortunately, with my co-host is usually, we he answers, asks some other questions, but I've run out of mine, so I don't want to keep you on, just kind of hemming and hawing. But I want to thank you for joining us, and people should definitely check out um, the graphic novel. Get it from your local comic book shop, support them. Um, and again, thank you for taking the time this evening to come on and talk about the book. And best of luck in the future with everything. And we'd love if whenever you have anything else, we'd love to have you back and yeah, break that down and see how you've grown as a writer since
Yeah, that'd be
since
great.
this.
And thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. As my co-host would say, it's a crappy world out there, but be nice to everybody. Go to your local comic store, support them. Buy Gatsby. Support AWA because they have some great stuff, and we'll see you next time.